Chapter 1. The Last of the Philosopher Kings. In another winter of iron skies and breath that smoked upon the air like offerings to a cold and indifferent heaven, the legions of Rome stood among the black pines of Germania and listened to the earth speak in the old tongues, the forest groaning with age, and the river running with a tireless, sullen hymn. It is said that the world narrows in winter to the nearness of wool and leather and the ache of bone, and that men learn then what endures and what fades. So it was when the philosopher upon the imperial throne came to the edge of empire to reckon with both barbarians and ghosts. Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations were fashioned not for the applause of theatres, but for the quiet governance of the self, moved along the muddy lines of campfires and wooden palisades, like a lamp carried through fog, and those who saw him remembered that wisdom may be a burden heavier than armor, and that a kingdom is a mirror which returns its ruler's soul. Snow drifted among the tents like ash from a distant pyre, and the standards of Rome, stiff with frost, pointed not only toward victory, but toward judgment. Maximus Decimus Meridius, general of the Felix legions, stood at the edge of the field and let the wind lay its hand upon his cheek, as if the north itself wished to test the mettle of the man who had driven it back time and time again. His thoughts were not with the trophies of triumph, nor with the Senate's measured praise, but with a modest farm beyond the world's noise, where barley bowed like worshippers, and a boy chased the long shadows of evening, and where a woman's voice could turn even silence into a home. A handful of soil he kept near, dark and fragrant with memory, a sacrament pressed between his fingers before battle, as though the earth remembered him and would not let him be lost. Against them the tribes gathered, painted by the cold and armored with the ferocity of those who do not count the years by marble monuments, but by the stubborn return of spring. When the first arrows hissed like serpents uncoiled, and the drums of the forest began their dreadful joyous thunder, Maximus gave the sign, and a wall of shields became a single will, and 1,000 men moved as one prayer. Fire took the underbrush, and ran along the line like a fiery script, and the horses' hooves beat the frozen ground, until the earth itself seemed to yearn upward to meet them. In that hour, the world was simple, not because it was kind, but because it was clear. Stand, hold, press forward, endure. And when the shouting passed, and the smoke thinned to a pale veil, the field lay strewn with the arguments of empire and defiance, and victory, which often wears the face of exhaustion, settled on Roman shoulders like a cloak too heavy to celebrate. Maximus went to the emperor then, mud frozen upon his greaves, and the iron smell of battle still near, and in the privacy of a tent whose canvas twitched with every wandering gust, the old man of Rome regarded the old truths of men. Marcus Aurelius, whom the world named wise, because he had learned how to keep company with sorrow without becoming its servant, spoke softly, and the words were more commandment to himself than order to another. He had seen the century turn toward spectacle, toward the gilded clamor of crowds and the sugar of flattery, and he feared that the soul of Rome had become thin beneath the weight of its own abundance, like gold hammered too wide. He told the general of a wish that was more than a wish, that Rome should be returned from the narrow hand of inheritance to the broader, steadier hands of her Senate, that the people should again know the difference between bread and virtue, between entertainment and honor. He did not ask for a crown to be worn, he asked for a burden to be carried, and he asked it of the one he trusted to love Rome more than himself. Maximus listened with the stillness of a man who understood both obedience and the quiet rebellion of conscience. He loved the emperor as a father in all the ways that matter and none that flatter, yet he loved his own home more, and he longed to set his sword upon a peg where only tools belong, and to let the seasons write their slow, patient scripture upon his hands. He told the emperor that he was not made for the purple, he was made for soil, for hearth, for the narrow and sufficient dominion of a husband and a father. The old man smiled the way mountains smile, with lines that have taken lifetimes to learn, and said that precisely this refusal was why the burden fit him, because power offered to those who do not desire it may hope to become service rather than appetite. But every lamp, however carefully guarded, throws a shadow, and within the palace pavilion a different hunger kept its own counsel. Commodus, born to the fragrance of cedar and incense, had spent his life hearing of that philosopher's Rome, the Rome that corrected itself and practiced restraint. Yet he had listened also to the crowds who wanted story rather than truth, and wanted the theater of an emperor who could be seen and adored. He longed not only to rule, but to be loved in the manner of statues, with garlands and applause, love that asks nothing of the lover except noise. Where his father weighed the soul in the balances of reason, the son weighed it in mirrors, and the reflection was always his own. In him the future of Rome turned its ring and found the gemstone cracked, though the light that fell through it seemed at first more dazzling for its fracture. In the nights that followed, the emperor's breath grew thin, and each dawn came like a messenger, bearing news it feared to speak. Marcus Aurelius summoned the general again, and there in a silence broken only by the tired flutter of canvas and the low murmur of sentries, he entrusted not an empire but a hope. He asked Maximus to serve as a steward who would return Rome to herself, to stand between the empire and its easier temptations, to be for a little while the spine that would not bend. Maximus, who had learned upon 100 fields that courage includes the courage to refuse, bowed his head as the weight of that request settled upon him, like winter upon fields that must still dream of spring. He did not accept a throne, he accepted a pilgrimage through the valley that opens when one chooses duty over longing. It is said that the cold can make truth ring like iron, and that night the truth rang in many hearts. Among the officers there were those who understood what a return to old virtues might cost the new pleasures of the age, and among the servants there were whispers that the prince had been passed over, though nothing had yet been spoken beyond this small and flickering circle of confidence. The tents burned with lamplight, their seams bright as constellations stitched close to earth, and the forest beyond the palisade watched with a patience older than cities. Somewhere a wolf called to its mate, and the sound ran along the camp like a string plucked upon a lyre, a single note drawn out until it became prayer. When morning found them, it found also the end of an age. Marcus Aurelius lay upon a bed that had learned the shape of suffering, and those near him saw that his eyes still held the same quiet amazement that a man may carry to the threshold of death, the amazement that the world continues, whether or not we are ready to let it. He placed his hand upon Maximus's arm with the last authority that love gives, and in that touch gave final form to his hope. Not long after, the philosopher's breath left him like a tide that knows the moon is elsewhere, and a hush fell that was not silence, but the sound of the invisible taking its place. News moves through armies the way wind moves through grass. It bends all in one direction, and the shape of the field is changed. Commodus entered the tent where grief still lingered, and found within it a decision he had not been made to hear, a decision spoken between a dying father and a living conscience. What happened then would be told later in many voices, for history often loosens the arrow of truth and lets it fly through cloud. But this much is known in the legend that survives: an emperor's wisdom met a son's terror of being unseen, and in that meeting something sacred was strangled. The night closed like a fist, and by dawn the philosopher was gone, and in his place there stood a reign that announced itself not with meditation, but with the trumpet of spectacle. Maximus stepped from the pavilion into a day that did not know how to carry itself, and the camp looked different, as if the world, being slightly tilted, had forced every object into a new humility. He felt the summons of the prince and the pressure of the future, felt as well the distant warmth of a hearth that waited for a door which might never open. A man may be faithful to two loves, but only one may be obeyed at a time, and in that razor's space between them, stories take their shape. He closed his eyes a moment, and saw the wheat of home waving, not with the wind, with that ancient assurance that the earth will one day return all sons to themselves. Thus the last of the philosopher kings departed and left Rome to the experiment of his absence, and the general who would not be emperor stood upon the narrow bridge between duty and desire. The forest breathed, the river went on singing its cold, indifferent song, and the standards of Rome clicked softly in the fretful breeze, as if the empire itself were thinking. Some remember that the light upon the snow that day was the color of old marble, faintly warm beneath a winter sun, and that for a little while it seemed possible for wisdom to outlast the theater of power. But the world moves, and so do men, and the path that leads away from the camp would soon lead through fire. And so the silence deepened, and the next page of the story waited, with its edges already singed by fate. Chapter 2. The General Who Would Not Rule. It is said that some men are fashioned not by the crowns they might bear, but by the fields that wait for their return, and that duty, when it is pure, smells less of incense than of earth. Maximus Decimus Meridius, whose name would one day be spoken in whispers beneath the arches of Rome, carried within him the map of a smaller kingdom, where wheat recorded the wind's handwriting, and a boy's laughter measured the afternoon. He wore command the way a farmer wears the season, accepting the weather as it comes, mending what is torn, sowing courage, and harvesting order with a steady hand. In him the legions saw not the theater of authority, but its quiet labor, an obedience to the common good that gave shape to 1,000 private hearts. He moved among his men with the patience of a shepherd and the gravity of a judge. He knew the names of those who bled, and the weight of each absence when a helmet lay unclaimed at sunset. In council he spoke as a man accustomed to listening first, laying out the battle as one might lay out a field for irrigation, allowing every channel of strength to find its natural course. Where others sought the laurel's sting and the roar of the crowd, he desired the unmarked contentment of usefulness, the rest that follows labor done rightly. Faithfulness had worn his features into the kind of calm that makes lesser men feel their noise. When the emperor called him into the dim sanctuary of the command tent, the air shifted as if the leather walls had drawn a breath of their own. Marcus Aurelius, who bore the crown as a reminder rather than a reward, spoke as though he were conversing with the fate of Rome, seated invisibly between them. He asked of Maximus not the glittering ascent that tempts a soldier's pride, but the harder descent into stewardship, the renunciation of private peace for public good. Rome, he said, must be returned to the chastening of laws and the humility of debate, to the Senate, whose many voices might, in their friction, rediscover the warmth of virtue. The empire had grown too fluent in spectacle. It must learn again the grammar of restraint. Maximus stood within that request, as a man stands within winter, feeling the ache in the bone, yet recognizing the season's necessity. He did not pretend ignorance of the honor implied, neither did he flatter it. He spoke of home without apology, of a wife whose letters were written in the gentle script of evenings, of a son who believed the world was a place one could outrun if one laughed hard enough. He asked the emperor for leave to return to that smaller, truer dominion, to let his sword rust into a memory, and his hands forget the weight of iron. But the old man, reading in him the very refusal that qualifies a guardian, pressed the trust back into his hands. In that moment, the general understood that his longing would not be dismissed. It would be postponed, and postponement is a kind of wound that does not bleed until much later. Outside, a different weather gathered. Commodus, restless as an actor waiting in the wings, practiced the expressions of virtue before a mirror he mistook for conscience. He had been taught that Rome was a machine of eternity, that emperors were the gears that kept the heavens in rhythm, and he wished to be such a gear, gleaming, admired, indispensable, without tolerating the grit that truly makes a machine go. Rumor, that ancient courier, had already threaded the camp with golden and iron whispers, that the philosopher intended a correction of power, that the prince would be asked to share the dais with law rather than sit alone upon it. Each torch beyond the palisade seemed to tremble with the thought that a long age was turning in its sleep. Maximus left the emperor with a promise, fitted not to arrogance but to service. He would stand where he was placed, for as long as he was needed. He went then to the quietest edge of camp, and pinched into his palm a little of the soil he had carried from home. The scent of it opened like a remembered hymn, sun upon threshing floors, rain stitching the fields into a single breathing cloth, the warmth of animals settling for the night. He closed his eyes and saw the narrow path that ran from his gate down to the stream where willow leaves combed the water, and he felt the world he loved draw near, and then withdraw, as if reluctant to be only memory. A man can live with many griefs, if he may touch, even briefly, the thing he grieves. It was then that the messenger found him, the prince's seal, bright upon a strip of wax that had not yet cooled. The summons named loyalty, and spoke of family, as if they were coins to be weighed, but the words carried an urgency that did not belong to gratitude. Maximus entered the pavilion, where Commodus awaited, and the air was sweet with oils that attempted to conceal another scent altogether, the sharp, metallic breath of fear. The prince's embrace was long but hollow. It rang like bronze struck in an empty hall. He spoke of love that had never learned the discipline of sacrifice, and asked of Maximus an oath that would bind the general not to Rome's good, which is elusive and hard, but to the prince's person, which is simple and immediate. Maximus bowed, for he was not made to despise men, yet the bow contained no surrender of the soul. Not long after, the emperor's chamber received the last of his meditations, unwritten but understood, that a life is a sentence whose meaning becomes clear at its period. The dawn that followed was thinner than most, and within it the prince's tears fell like beads from a theatre mask, real and rehearsed at once. When Commodus announced the new day, it came bearing commands shaped like embraces and honors that flattered like chains. Maximus, who had been asked by one man to protect Rome from the hunger of one man, found himself between two certainties: that refusal would be counted rebellion, and that agreement would be treachery against the very hope entrusted to him. He chose, as he always had, the path that keeps faith with the dead and the living alike. When the order was given that he should offer immediate allegiance and receive command of the praetorians as a seal of friendship, he asked instead for a moment's leave to pray among his men. The moment was granted, and a darker order ran beneath it, like a second river under snow. Riders went out with sealed instructions to a place that did not know they were coming: his farm, his wife, his child, while another detachment prepared a more local verdict for the general himself. the world can be swift when injustice rides. Maximus was led beyond the camp under a sky, the color of hammered lead, to a place where the trees stood like unpersuaded witnesses. There the sentence was spoken in the calm voice of procedure, and the blade that had so often defended Rome was to be answered now by Rome's own iron. He asked to kneel, not to the order but to his God, and he prayed in the oldest language. A soldier knows that his family be spared, that his soul be held, that his hands not forget mercy, even in extremity. The executioners, who were not evil but only obedient, hesitated before the man who had once placed victory into their mouths like bread, and in that hesitation the story found the seam it needed. Iron met flesh, but not as intended. When the first blow faltered, the second missed, and the third found only cloak. Maximus was already upon them, with the dreadful skill granted to those who have long preferred peace. He took from the ground what weapons the ground would give, and when the grove at last was quiet again, he was a man with blood upon his hands who had not desired blood. He bound his wound with a strip of the very order that had condemned him, and turned his face toward home, because the shortest road through grief is the one that goes straight to its source. He rode as men ride, when the body has become an argument with time. Day collapsed into day. Hoofbeats counted the distance, like a rosary of dust. He crossed fields that once belonged to families, now sewn into the empire's tapestry of forgetting. For Rome collects both harvests and histories. He drank from streams that remembered nothing, and slept where the ground permitted, waking from dreams in which a child ran ahead and would not turn when called. The sky wheeled with its indifferent splendor, and the sun performed its old, unastonished duties. At the edge of memory, the road lifted and turned, and he saw at last the hill that had always been more than a hill, a small throne from which one could watch the seasons sit and rise. Smoke marked the horizon the way a scar marks the face of a beloved. He knew before he knew. The air was already telling it, thick with a sweetness that does not belong to bread. He urged the horse forward, though it had given him nearly all it had to give, and the farm came into view like a liturgy broken in the middle. The gate hung open. The fields were black letters upon a burned page. He entered the silence that follows violence, and found within it the end of one world and the beginning of another. Thus the general who would not rule came to the threshold where his life would be divided into before and after. He had refused the purple and been repaid with ashes. He had chosen the narrow dominion of love and been exiled even from that. Yet within him, something older than grief lifted its head, the iron patience that endures because it must, and the memory of a promise given to a dying man whose hope had asked to borrow his strength. The wind moved through the blackened reeds with the sound of garments in a temple, and the road beyond the farm ran on into a country without maps. And so the silence deepened, and the story, having taken his home, prepared to take his name, that it might return it to him later, bright with a different kind of honor. Chapter 3. The Death of the Emperor. Night hung over the camp like a suspended breath. In the pavilion, where the scent of oils and fading incense still clung to the air, the emperor's body lay upon a couch draped in dark wool, his face pale as unpolished marble. The physicians had long since departed, their ministrations reduced to the soft language of futility. The candles flickered as though uncertain of their purpose, and the shadows on the walls bowed and rose again like mourners rehearsing their grief. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who had ruled as though his reign were a dialogue with the divine, had gone where reason itself must yield to mystery. Commodus stood beside him, and in that dim silence the world seemed to incline toward his hunger. He traced a finger along the veins of his father's lifeless hand, as though to convince himself that the warmth could be recalled by will alone, but the chill was already rising. In that coldness, the prince read the truth that would haunt him all his life, that love cannot be compelled, not even by empire, and where love will not serve, fear will be made to kneel. Outside, the sentries kept their watch, unaware that within the tent the future of Rome had already altered its course. The death of a ruler is always more than the death of a man. It is the unfastening of meaning, for in Marcus Aurelius, philosophy and power had been married. However uneasily, in Commodus, that union would dissolve, and Rome would learn once more what it meant to be governed by appetite rather than wisdom. He sat beside the body for a long while, his eyes wide with a strange, childlike vacancy. There was in him the memory of a boy who had once sought praise from a father too occupied with the cares of the cosmos to notice the tremble of small ambitions. That boy had waited for a word that never came. The man beside the bier now meant to make the world supply it. When he emerged from the tent, the air felt sharper, as though the cold had hardened into glass. The officers and guards who approached bent their knees to him with the instinct of obedience. Commodus, feeling the shape of their fear, mistook it for devotion. He announced the emperor's passing in tones of sorrow that carried the rhythm of rehearsal. Orders followed swiftly, as orders do when they are meant to erase the memory of what came before. The Senate would be informed. The legions would swear allegiance. The new dawn would not wait for morning. But within the circle of lamplight at the heart of the camp, another figure knelt beside the bed of the dead. Maximus had come when summoned by the rumor that travels faster than command, that invisible herald which attends every throne's undoing. He found the tent guarded not by ceremony but by unease. The guards stepped aside without speaking. Inside, he saw the emperor's still form, and all the words he had ever meant to say turned to dust upon his tongue. He had known death on battlefields, but this death was a greater silence. It was the stilling of the compass by which Rome had known its way. He bowed his head and whispered a prayer in the rough Latin of the soldier, asking that the gods receive their philosopher gently. He thought of the trust placed upon him, that impossible hope to return the empire to itself, and in that thought he felt the weight of destiny press against his ribs. Yet when he rose, Commodus stood before him, his face wet with tears that glimmered like a mask of water. "Father is dead," the prince said, and his voice trembled on the edge of supplication. "The empire needs strength, my friend. I need loyalty. Swear to me now." Maximus looked upon him with the calm that only honesty affords. He saw in Commodus's eyes the chaos that waits at the edge of every crown, the terror of being insufficient to one's inheritance. "Sire," he said quietly, "your father believed Rome should be a republic again. He dreamed of a time when her greatness would be the virtue of many, not the will of one. That was his wish." Commodus' expression hardened. His wish was betrayal. He answered, "Do you call me unworthy? Will you stand against me, general?" Maximus did not speak at once, for he had learned that silence is the only answer that cannot be twisted. At last he said, "I serve Rome." And in that reply, Commodus heard his own doom, for the man who serves an idea cannot be owned by a throne. When dawn came, it brought the sound of distant horns, the ceremony of succession disguised as lamentation. The legions were gathered in formation, their armor gleaming with the false purity of morning light. Banners snapped in the wind like the wings of restless spirits. Commodus appeared before them, crowned in gold, his voice ringing across the field as he proclaimed himself Caesar, The soldiers cheered, because soldiers always cheer when commanded to, but beneath their discipline moved an unease as subtle as tremor in the earth. Later, in the privacy of his new court, Commodus summoned his praetorian captain. His words were quiet, almost gentle. "The general cannot be trusted," he said. "He loved my father more than he loves me, and loyalty divided is treason. You will ride out tonight." The captain bowed without meeting his gaze, as men do when the orders they receive come wrapped in shame. At sunset, Maximus was taken to the edge of the camp. The sentence was simple: death for disobedience. He did not struggle. He had seen enough of life to know that struggle is often a courtesy denied to those who have already lost. They led him into the woods where the ground was hard and the air thick with the promise of snow. The executioners hesitated. One whispered that this was the man who had led them to victory against the tribes. Maximus raised his eyes to the trees and said only, "Strength and honor." The phrase fell into the silence like a benediction. They raised their swords, and history turned its face away. What followed has been told many times, each telling losing something of its simplicity. Some say he escaped by cunning, others by the mercy of the gods. The truth, as always, is quieter. He lived because he must. The steel that should have ended him faltered, and the forest swallowed what the empire meant to erase. He fled into exile, wounded and hunted, a man unmade and unnamed. Behind him, Rome marched toward its new age of spectacle. The philosopher was gone. The gladiator was being born, and in the distance, the cold wind carried the faint echo of the emperor's last counsel, a whisper that might have been prayer or prophecy. There is nothing new under the sun, save the faces of those who forget. Thus ended the reign of the philosopher king, and thus began the long descent of Rome into its own reflection. The stars burned above the frozen plains, untroubled by the affairs of men, and somewhere between life and death, duty and dream, a soldier rode onward, following a road that led not to empire, but to memory, and so the silence deepened. Chapter 4. The Slave and the Arena. It is said that the world narrows to the width of a chain before it widens again, and that a man who has lost his name learns first the sound of iron before he recalls the sound of his own heart. Maximus awoke to the stench of dust and blood, and the mutter of a foreign tongue. His wrists burned with the bite of manacles, his breath shallow, his vision shifting between waking and dream. The last memory of home still flickered behind his eyes, the soft curve of a field beneath morning light, the laughter of his son running toward him. That memory, too fragile to speak aloud, was all that kept him from vanishing into the numbness of death. He had been taken by slavers who combed the wreckage of empire for what could be sold. Men broken, beasts wounded, weapons that still remembered their purpose. They found him fevered and near the end, yet even half dead, the body bore the marks of discipline, the scars of command, the steadiness of will. He was sold for less than a horse, but more than a common thief, and thus came into the possession of Proximo, a merchant of blood and spectacle who bought men as one might buy mirrors for the appetites of the crowd. The caravan wound through the wastes of Zucabar, the air thick with the scent of sand and sweat. The world there was made of edges, sunlight hard as glass by day, cold that sliced through bone by night. The cages rattled as they moved, a procession of silence broken only by the rattle of wheels and the dull clank of chain. Among the captives were men who had once been soldiers, thieves, or worse, and each carried his past like a brand upon the soul. Maximus spoke to no one. His voice, when it returned, was a stranger's, At last they reached the compound, an amphitheater carved from the bones of the desert, its walls scoured by wind and age. Here men were taught to kill with grace, to die with purpose, and to entertain between both. Proximo stood upon the sand, as a priest might stand before his altar. His eyes, sharp and weary, measured each new slave with the precision of one who knows the value of pain. "I was once as you are," he told them, "spared by the mercy of the crowd, freed by the will of an emperor, and I learned that mercy is a coin minted only in blood." His laughter rang harsh and brief, then faded like incense. The days that followed were a discipline of dust. The new men were beaten into form, their old selves stripped away with the lash. They learned the rituals of survival, the weight of the net, the arc of the sword, the rhythm of sand beneath the feet. They learned to time their breath to the roar of strangers who demanded beauty from brutality. Maximus moved through it all with the calm of a ghost. He obeyed, fought, and endured, yet his eyes betrayed no hunger for victory, only a slow and gathering patience, as if time itself were his ally. In the arena, death was not an intruder, but an invited guest. The crowd came not to see men die, but to be reminded that they themselves still lived. Each contest was a small eternity, sand rising like smoke, blood soaking into ground already rich with memory. Maximus fought with an economy that unsettled his captors. He killed without spectacle, as though performing a weary duty rather than a violent art. Proxima watched from the shadows and saw in him the ghost of an older Rome, one that had known discipline before decadence. The other gladiators came to respect him. In the only way such men can, they tested him. There was Juba of Numidia, whose faith survived even the empire's cruelty, and Hagen the German, whose laughter hid a sorrow as deep as the forests he had lost. Together they formed a brotherhood, born not of affection, but of proximity to death. In the nights when the desert grew cold, they spoke of freedom as one might speak of a dream, already half forgotten. Maximus listened, his gaze fixed upon the stars, those same indifferent witnesses that had looked upon Rome's founding and would one day look upon its ashes. When his turn came to face the sand, the crowd learned a new kind of silence. He entered the arena, not as a supplicant, but as one who remembered the world before the games. His movements were deliberate, his strikes exact. Each kill was a prayer, each victory an accusation. The others called him Spaniard, for he would not give his name. In that anonymity he found protection, his past hidden, his purpose gathering like a storm beneath calm skies. Word of him began to spread. In markets and taverns, men spoke of a fighter who moved as though guided by memory rather than rage, who looked upon his enemies with pity. Proximo, shrewd and restless, saw profit in this myth. "The crowd loves a mystery," he told him one evening, pacing before the iron bars, "and Rome, my friend, loves nothing more than to consume its heroes." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "One day we will go to Rome itself, the great Colosseum, the emperor's gaze. The gods of sand and blood will know your name." Maximus said nothing. In his mind Rome was not marble and triumph, but smoke rising from his home. Yet he understood that fate, once set in motion, has no patience for denial. If the road led back to the heart of empire, then so be it. He would walk it not as a servant of glory, but as the instrument of justice that still burned beneath his scars. Weeks bled into months, and with each battle the Spaniard's legend grew. His comrades fought beside him with renewed fervor, carried by the strange dignity that seemed to follow wherever he stood. They began to live by his silence, to find courage in his restraint. Proximo's men won favor in every province, their games drawing crowds that roared for more. Yet beneath the cheers there lingered something else, a yearning unspoken, a hunger for meaning. Even the mob, in its cruelty, could feel that this one fought not for coin nor for life, but for something purer than either. One evening, after victory had filled the air with dust and shouting, Maximus sat alone beside the gate. Juba came to him and said, "You are not like the others. You fight as though you wish to die, yet death will not have you." Maximus turned toward him, and for the first time spoke the truth aloud. "I fight so that I may see them again, my wife, my son. Until then, I will not die." Juba bowed his head, for he knew that faith takes many forms. The next morning, the desert wind shifted, and with it came word from Rome. Commodus, emperor of the world, had decreed a grand festival of games to honor the gods and the glory of his reign. Champions from every corner of the empire would fight beneath his gaze. Proximo's troop was summoned to the capital, their reputation preceding them like a storm front of rumor and expectation. As they prepared to depart, Maximus stood once more at the threshold of destiny. The desert lay behind him, vast and indifferent. Ahead stretched the long road to the Colosseum, where sand would meet marble and the living would parade before the dead. He did not look back. The slave who had once been a general now walked toward the heart of his captivity, and within him the faint, impossible promise of freedom stirred like the breath of dawn. And so the silence deepened. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Colosseum. The road to Rome was long and indifferent, cut through lands that had forgotten their own wars. Dust rose behind the caravan like the ghost of a vanished army, and each dawn unveiled a new horizon that looked no different from the one before. For the men in chains, distance was a circle, not a line. They left the desert only to enter another, the empire itself, vast and hungry, devouring everything it touched. Maximus rode among them in silence, the rhythm of the wheels marking time, as if some invisible hand were measuring his patience. The thought of Rome did not stir pride within him. It was a city of ghosts, and he would walk among them soon. When at last they reached the capital, the air itself seemed heavy with spectacle. The streets trembled beneath the sound of drums and the clamor of markets. Marble towers rose like frozen waves, their whiteness hiding centuries of blood. Everywhere, statues watched with sightless serenity, the gods of stone who had outlived their worshippers. Proxima's company was led through the forum, past columns, inscribed with victories long since decayed, toward the Colosseum, that vast machine built to turn cruelty into art. Its shadow fell across them like an eclipse. Inside, the air was cool and thick with history. The sand of the arena was not sand at all, but dust ground from 1,000 bodies and 1,000 cheers. It smelled of iron, incense, and time. The walls breathed with echoes, emperors crowned and murdered, slaves made into legends, beasts and men dying to the same applause. Rome had made eternity its stage, and the crowd its chorus. Every soul that entered this place became a note in its unending hymn. Maximus looked upon it without awe. He had seen temples built to gods who no longer answered. The Colosseum was such a temple, but its god was spectacle itself, a divinity of eyes and noise. Proxima stood beside him, his face softened by memory. "I was here once," he said quietly. "I fought where you will stand. I lived because the crowd allowed it. There is no greater power in the world than the love of Rome." Maximus answered only, "Then Rome has forgotten what love is." The games began beneath a sun so bright it seemed to mock the blood it revealed. Horns sounded, the gates groaned open, and the first tide of men poured onto the sand. They were dressed as Carthaginians, as Thracians, as whatever the script demanded. The crowd cheered not for victory, but for narrative. They came to see themselves reflected in the dying. Romans triumphant, barbarians crushed, the empire eternal. Commodus watched from his marble throne, his face painted with satisfaction, his sister Lucilla beside him, her eyes shadowed by thought. The emperor's joy was that of a child who has broken something irreplaceable and waits for the applause. When the gate opened for Proximus' troop, the crowd fell briefly silent, curious. Among the fighters was the Spaniard, whose name had begun to move through taverns and markets like a rumor that refused to fade. The herald's voice carried across the amphitheater. Survivors of Zuccobar, champions of the frontier, let Rome witness their courage. The slaves entered in formation, shields raised, eyes narrow against the glare. Maximus walked at their head, his armor dull with dust, his face hidden behind the visor that would become legend. The first engagement was a reenactment of Carthage's fall. Chariots thundered across the sand, nets whistled through the air, and lions roared behind their gates. The battle unfolded like theater until Maximus broke the script. When the moment came for defeat, he reversed it. His commands, clear and cold, cut through the chaos. Form line, hold the center. The others obeyed, out of habit, not thought. The formation tightened, the chariots overturned, and within moments, the mock Carthaginians had conquered their Roman masters. The crowd hesitated, unsure if it should boo or cheer. Then, as the impossible became glorious, the roar began, a sound so vast it seemed to bend the sky. From his seat above, Commodus leaned forward, astonished. "My history is being rewritten," he murmured, and his sister's gaze found his. "Perhaps Rome remembers more than you think," she said, but the emperor only smiled, mistaking irony for admiration. When Maximus removed his helmet before the emperor's box, the silence that followed was not mere surprise, it was revelation. His face, scarred and unbowed, carried the memory of command. His eyes met those of the ruler he had once served, and for a moment all the noise of empire vanished. Commodus rose slowly, his voice breaking the stillness. "Why doesn't the hero tell us his name?" Maximus answered with the calm of one speaking from beyond grief. "My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the north, general of the Felix legions, loyal servant to the true emperor, Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance, in this life or the next." The words struck like iron upon marble. The crowd erupted, divided between terror and awe. Commodus forced a smile that barely reached his eyes. "He shall continue to entertain," he said, "so long as he lives." The court laughed, but the sound was brittle. Beneath the laughter, fear began its slow migration through the marble halls. Days turned to weeks, and each game became a chapter in a larger reckoning. The Spaniards' victories drew crowds beyond measure. Senators whispered that the soul of Rome had returned to the arena. Lucilla visited Proxima under pretense of trade, her voice soft with urgency. "He must survive," she said. "If Rome is to be free, the people must remember what dignity looks like." Proxima, old enough to have seen freedom purchased with blood, nodded wearily. "The gods favor him," he said, though he did not know whether he meant the living or the dead. Each night, Maximus sat in the dark of the holding cells, his fingers tracing patterns in the sand. The grains slid between them, like time itself. He dreamed of wheat fields and laughter, Of a gate that no longer stood, Juba would sit nearby, whispering prayers to his ancestors. "Do you think they hear us?" he once asked. Maximus replied, "They hear the truth in silence." Above them, Commodus plotted his theater of reconciliation, a grand contest in which he would descend to the arena and display his courage before the people. It would be a charade of virtue, another act in the empire's long play of illusion. But in dreams and whispers, another story was taking shape, the return of a man who could not be killed, the shadow of a general walking through Rome's heart, as both slave and judge. The Colosseum slept fitfully those nights, its corridors sighing with the memory of all who had passed beneath its gates. Some said the sand moved, even when the wind was still, as though the dead were restless. And when the dawn came, pale and uncertain, it found the city waiting for its next spectacle, unaware that in the center of its grandest stage, destiny had already chosen its final act. And so the silence deepened. Chapter 6. The Last Duel. The days of spectacle grew longer, as though the sun itself lingered to witness the empire's vanity. Rome had become a theater that mistook its applause for prayer. In the Colosseum, the crowd no longer cared for victory or defeat. They came to see one man defy an emperor and survive. The legend of the Spaniard had grown beyond rumor, woven into song and superstition. Some said he could not die, that the gods themselves watched from the clouds. Others whispered that vengeance had found flesh and wore his face, and Commodus, who ruled both stage and sword, began to see in every cheer the measure of his own fading divinity. He watched from his throne as Maximus won another battle, his composure unbroken, his mercy withheld. Even the sand seemed to bow to him, the crowd roaring his name until it drowned the emperor's own. Each victory stripped another thread from Commodus's illusion, until the empire he claimed to embody began to look elsewhere for its reflection. It was not power that frightened him, but irrelevance. In the halls of marble and shadow, plots took root. Lucilla, weary of silence, conspired with senators who remembered what Rome once meant. They met in chambers thick with candle smoke, where whispers replaced the rhetoric of the Senate floor. Their plan was not rebellion, it was remembrance, to restore law where theater had replaced justice, to return reason where fear had built its throne. And at the heart of their hope stood the man who no longer desired life, but carried honor like a wound that refused to close. One night, beneath the vaults of the arena, Lucilla came to Maximus. Her voice trembled with both fear and reverence. "The Senate waits for you," she said. "They will rise if you lead." He shook his head. "I am no leader now. I am the slave they made me." She stepped closer. "Then be the slave who saves them. Rome needs what you are, not what you were." In her eyes he saw the same light he had once seen in the emperor's tent, a hope that asked nothing for itself. He agreed, not for Rome, but for the memory of all who had believed in her. But the walls of empire have many ears. The plot reached Commodus like a scent carried on wind. His smile, when he heard it, was the smile of a child who discovers a new cruelty. He would not strike in darkness. He would make vengeance a pageant. "Let it be in the arena," he told his praetorian, "before the people, before the gods. Let them see that no man lives who defies Caesar." His plan was as theatrical as it was simple. He would meet the Spaniard in combat, wounding him first, ensuring victory not through courage, but through deceit. Even death, for Commodus, had to be choreographed. The morning of the final games dawned beneath a sky the color of brass. The Colosseum throbbed with expectation, a living creature of noise and movement. Banners fluttered like wounded wings, and the air smelled of sweat and incense. The emperor entered to thunderous acclaim, his armor gleaming like gold trapped in fire. Behind him, guards carried the instruments of ceremony and execution alike. He descended into the sand, where Maximus awaited, unarmored save for a breastplate dull with dust and time. Commodus approached him with a serenity that fooled none but himself. "They call you the savior of Rome," he said softly. "Let us see if Rome will save you." Then, with a gesture hidden from the crowd, he motioned for the dagger. The blade slipped between armor and flesh, a serpent's kiss beneath the ribs. Maximus staggered, but did not fall. Commodus stepped back, smiling to the audience, and signaled the duel to begin. The opening clash was slow, deliberate, like a ritual remembered from a former life. Maximus's sword met the emperor's with a hollow clang that echoed through every corridor of the amphitheater. The wound burned like iron, but his will did not waver. Around them, the crowd rose and fell in waves of sound. Each strike was a prayer, each parry a refusal. Commodus, confident in his hidden victory, fought with flourish and mockery. Yet as moments passed, the smile began to fade, for though the general's breath came ragged, his blade grew surer. It was not strength that carried him, it was purpose. When at last Commodus's sword was torn from his hand, the crowd gasped as though the air itself had been struck. The emperor stumbled, his mouth twisting between plea and pride. "Give me another sword," he cried. But his guards, bound by ritual, did not move. He drew a dagger from his side, lunging forward with the desperation of a man who sees his reflection shatter. Maximus caught his wrist, and in that instant the two men stood as mirrors, one hollowed by vanity, the other filled by loss. The blade turned. The emperor's cry was brief, his fall quieter still. Maximus stood over him, trembling, the dagger slick with ending. The crowd erupted, half in horror, half in awe. Lucilla pressed through the guards, her eyes bright with tears. "Maximus," she whispered, "you have saved Rome." He looked at her, as if from a great distance. "Is she worth saving?" he asked, though the words were more exhale than speech. He staggered then, the wound within him deepening beyond repair. The sand felt soft beneath his knees, and the light above grew wide and pale. In the blur of the world fading, he saw the gates of Elysium opening, the field of wheat, endless and golden, his son running toward him, his wife smiling in the sun. The noise of the crowd fell away until only the wind remained, and within it, the voice of home. Lucilla knelt beside him, her hand upon his brow. "Go to them," she said. "You are free." And when his breath left him, it left as gently as a prayer completed. The arena, which had known 1,000 deaths, fell silent for the first time in memory. Juba, standing among the slaves, closed his eyes and whispered, "Now we are free." That night, Rome slept uneasily. The body of the emperor was borne away in procession, while the people spoke, not of his reign, but of the man who had defied him. In taverns and temples, stories began of the general who would not rule, the slave who would not kneel, the gladiator who freed Rome by dying. His name passed through the streets like a benediction, and above them all, the Colosseum stood silent, its sand cooled by shadow, its god of spectacle sated for a time. It is said that at dawn, a breeze moved through the empty arena, carrying with it the faint scent of grain. The sand shifted, as though stirred by unseen hands, and the sun, rising over the eastern arch, cast a pale light upon the place where he had fallen. Some say that in that moment, the empire itself paused to listen to the echo of a man's last breath becoming legend, and so the silence deepened. Night settled over Rome, like the slow closing of an ancient book. The torches that had burned for the games guttered in their brackets, leaving trails of smoke that drifted upward toward a sky heavy with stars. The Colosseum, emptied of its roar, now seemed less a monument than a tomb, its arches yawning in silence, its corridors still echoing with the memory of a single name. Beneath those arches, the scent of iron and dust lingered like incense after prayer. The crowd had departed, the emperor's banners had been removed, and the sand, newly raked, bore no trace of the blood that had sanctified it. Yet in the hush that followed, something unseen remained, a quiet that was not absence but reverence. Maximus Decimus Meridius had come to Rome as a slave and left it as legend. The story of his life spread like the breath of dawn through every quarter of the city. The soldiers spoke of him in the barracks. The poor whispered his name as though it were a charm. Even the patricians behind their latticed windows repeated his words. What we do in life echoes in eternity. For some, it was defiance. For others, comfort. For Rome itself, it was remembrance. Lucilla stood at the edge of the arena as the last torches were extinguished. The moon's light poured through the upper arches, pale and unwavering. She thought of her father and of the promise he had placed upon the shoulders of one man. That promise had been fulfilled, not through power, but through sacrifice. Around her, the air felt vast, as if the city itself had drawn a breath of humility. He was a soldier of Rome, she said softly, her words carried by the wind, and a servant of her better self. Beyond the walls, in a quiet corner of the necropolis, a simple grave was raised, unmarked save for a small bronze token pressed into the earth, bearing the likeness of a wheat stalk. Juba came there at dawn, carrying a small pouch of sand from Zuccobar. He knelt, poured it over the mound, and spoke to the silence as though it were listening. "I will see you again," he said, "but not yet." Then he turned toward the east, where the sun lifted its first pale thread of light, and the warmth touched his face like an answer. In the days that followed, the Senate moved swiftly. Commodus was declared unfit for divine honors, his statues removed, his name struck from inscriptions. The games were suspended for a time, the theaters closed, as if Rome herself were in mourning. The senators, remembering the emperor's last decree before death, began to speak once more of the Republic. Their voices were uncertain, their courage thin, yet something had changed. The idea that one man's virtue might still redeem the world. And though history would grind its slow circles through centuries of ruin and revival, the echo of that idea endured. As for Proximo, who had sold men to their deaths and bought from them his freedom, he too was remembered differently. His arenas fell silent, his apprentices scattered. Yet those who had fought under his banner spoke of him with a strange affection, for he had seen in Maximus the thing he had long forgotten, that even among chains the soul may stand upright. In the end, he died as he had lived, between commerce and faith, uncertain which had been his master. Rome continued, as empires do. Its markets reopened, its temples filled, its crowds found new distractions. Yet every now and then, when a soldier raised his sword in salute, or when a child asked the meaning of courage, someone would speak of the Spaniard who had walked through death to reclaim his honor. They would tell of the general who became a slave, the slave who became a gladiator, the gladiator who defied an emperor, and through defiance found peace, and the listeners would fall silent, sensing that the story was not merely of one man, but of all who seek light beyond the veil of dust. It is said that in the quietest hour of night, when the wind moves through the ruins and the moon rides high above the broken stones, the sand of the Colosseum still stirs. The motion is subtle, a whisper rather than a tremor, as though the earth remembers the footsteps of those who fought there. And if one listens closely, the sound that comes is not the roar of the crowd, nor the clash of steel. It is the faint sigh of a field of wheat moving in an unseen breeze. In that sound lies the memory of a promise kept, for what we do in life does not fade with the body, nor end with the silence of the grave. It travels onward, through the hearts it touches, through the ages that remember, and so the echo of Maximus endures, not as triumph nor vengeance, but as peace. The man who sought only home found eternity instead. And in the hush that followed, as dawn began to gild the edge of the world, Rome itself seemed to pause, listening to its own heartbeat. For a moment it was enough, and so the silence deepened,